I'm Janine Turner, founder of Constituting America. Welcome to our annual academic study entitled History Holds the Key to the Future, or as Shakespeare said, what is past is prologue. This year's study is entitled The Genius of America, A Journey into Our Republic, a study on Alexis De Tocqueville's Democracy in America. The works of democratic poets will often offer immense and incoherent images, overloaded depictions, and bizarre composites in imaginations that depart from reality rather than adorn the ideal. Alexis de Tocqueville. This essay is entitled A Few Sources of Poetry in Democratic Nations, Why American Writers and Speakers Are Often Bombastic, and a few remarks on the theater of democratic nations. Volume 2, Part 1, Chapters 17 through 19, pages 458 through 469, and the edition of the book we are using is by Harvey, Mansfield, and Delba, Winthrop by the University of Chicago Press. This essay is written by Matthew Van Hook. Democracy in America, Volume 2, Part 2, Chapter 1. Why Democratic Peoples Show a More Ardent and More Lasting Love for Equality Than for Freedom. By the time de Tocqueville's readers arrive at his chapter on the sources of poetry in democratic nations, he has already passed his preliminary judgment that, quote, up to the present, America has had only a very few remarkable writers. It has not had great historians and does not count one poet, end quote. The few American writers known to Europeans, such as Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper, were read because they stoked fascination for those trying to understand America and its revolution. The, quote, poems of democracy, end quote, might hold similar explanatory power and purpose, but they fall short of de Tocqueville's definition of true poetry as, quote, the search for and depiction of the ideal, end quote. In America, he searches for the poetic instead of true poetry. Poetry aimed at the ideal, quote, will not have for its goal to represent the true, but to adorn it and to offer a superior image to the mind, end quote. In democratic social states, however, the true and ideal are wrapped up together in, quote, material enjoyments, end quote, that spark only a certain kind of limited imagination. Gatsby's fabulous and conspicuous wealth, the savvy monopolist conquering of a system from railroads to software, the investigative journalist takedown of these sorts. They represent only the, quote, ideal, end quote, of real people doing practical things well without the assistance of aristocratic position, divine intervention, or magic. Democratic social states pull the poet's imaginations down from the clouds and confine them to, quote, the visible and real world, end quote. So it should not surprise de Tocqueville's readers then or now that, like the relentless sun over the great American desert, equality has dried up the old sources of poetry. New sources of poetry must emerge from a world entirely new. And de Tocqueville describes this occurring in two phases. When estates that span centuries no longer survive a single generational split, and names and titles are scarcely known even as historical artifacts, the democratic poets first turned toward, quote, inanimate nature, end quote, to fill the void. The Mississippi River and Appalachian Mountains replaced the lost objects of aristocratic imagination. This temporary turn, however, was only the brief transition to the true democratic turn inward. De Tocqueville is, quote, convinced that in the long term, democracy turns the imagination away from all that is external to man to fix it only on man, end quote. This inward turn toward the human race has great potential for the poetic, but only if it can be made to think of humanity's shape and future. Can such a turn be expected from Americans living in a social state of equality? As de Tocqueville explains, quote, one can conceive of nothing so small, so dull, so filled with miserable interest, in a word, so anti-poetic, as the life of a man in the United States, end quote. Enter Emily Dickinson, stage left. One can almost imagine a 10-year-old Dickinson picking up the newly released second volume of Democracy in America, reading this chapter, and determining to fulfill the author's expectations for distinctively American poems. These examinations of small souls are not poetry proper, but there is still something poetic to be found in them. While de Tocqueville seems to predict the arrival of Dickinson, Whitman, Frost, and other democratic poets willing to mine the mundane for transcendent ideas, he fears a more extreme future. He expects that the bombastic language already so prevalent in American writing will saturate poetry as well, and, quote, the works of democratic poets will often offer immense and incoherent images, overloaded depictions, and bizarre composites in imaginations that depart from reality rather than adorn the ideal, end quote. He finds this already taken place in the theaters where spectacle rules, though admittedly still bounded in his time of a remnant of Puritan cultural restraints and township laws. De Tocqueville's theater chapter provides a fitting bookend to his discussion of poetry because his readers can imagine the democratic poetry of America combining spectacle, passions, and ideas with the smallness of a single democratic soul longing for achievable human greatness. When searching for the democratic poetry of the present, one need only look to the spoken word poetry, music of the blues, and other distinctly American sources that come together on stage in Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton. This essay was written by Matthew Van Hook. Matthew Van Hook received his doctoral degree in political science from the University of Notre Dame, with a focus on political theory, constitutional studies, and American political thought. He also holds a master's degree in security studies from the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. Prior to joining the Torrey Honors College faculty, Van Hook served on active duty as an Air Force pilot and political science professor at his alma mater, the U.S. Air Force Academy. His research and published work ranges from the statesmanship of Abraham Lincoln to politics and law in the novels of Harper Lee.